Right, thank you all for coming today. This is the first in our External Voices series of guest talks, where we are getting people from outside the UCBC Criminology department to talk about their work. Hopefully this will do a couple of things at least. The first thing, hopefully, it's going to broaden your experience of being a criminology undergraduate, which we think is hopefully going to be beneficial. And secondly, we hope that it's going to help you with your research. All of us in this room, we've all got commitments and responsibilities to do research. So hearing people from outside the institution and how they've done their research, I think is going to be very useful to you. Now, we're delighted that the first person to start this series off is Professor Joe Sim. Joe is from Liverpool John Moores University and is a well-published author and has been responsible for a lot of research over the years, and basically I don't need to say any more really, apart from I want to introduce Joe's talk. The title of his talk is Critical Criminological Research and State Institutions, Challenges and Issues. So please feel free to take as many notes as you like, and well, the title of the talk, oh yeah, thank you for everybody, Critical Criminological Research. The talk itself is being recorded, as you can see there, it's being filmed at the back. So yeah, just be aware that you are being observed. Yeah, I think they've got that. Basically, yeah, nobody can sit behind the camera. The URL to this recording will be available in a week. So you will all be able to have access to this recording. And as I say, the full title of the talk and other things will be distributed that way. Okay, so pass you on to Joe.
Well, hello everybody, thank you very much for coming today. I'm going to talk about prison research and the role of research from a critical criminological perspective in prisons. But just before I do that, I want to say thanks very much to Phil for inviting me over here. I've never been to Blackburn before. I was going to come in 2003 with my team, Glasgow Celtic, were playing Blackburn in the UEFA Cup, but I never made it over sadly. I'm from Glasgow, as you probably recognise, although I've lived in England for 30 years. So my accent hasn't become totally anglicised yet, apparently. It's much better than it was when I first got here. But if I degenerate into Glaswegian vernacular and speaking too fast or anything like that, then of course please stop me and just tell me or give us a wave and I'll slow down dramatically with regard to that. Also, please, of course, if there's any point that you want, if there's anything unclear about what I'm going to say or talk about, then please just give us a wave and please just ask the question. Afterwards, I'm going to be around for cups of tea and coffee. So if folk want to have a chat as well, that's really cool by me. Or you might think, God, I've heard enough of that Glaswegian to last me a lifetime, so I just want to go away and do what you want to do in the afternoon. But please, if you want to, I'd be delighted to kind of be around and have a chat. So I just want to see the opening. Yeah. Now, I've been in critical criminology for a long time now, and I started in the mid-1970s when I was very, very young, when I graduated. And I got offered a job as a researcher going into prisons in Scotland, and I've spent the last 40 years going in and out of different prisons. My last visit was in July to Grendon Underwood prison. And at that time I also became involved in the prisoners' rights movement because having spent a year in prisons in Scotland, the reality was very, very different from what was on television and in the mass media. People were living in absolutely appalling conditions. Brutality, in many respects, cut across a number of the institutions. And there was a deep sense of dehumanisation in the institution. I spent a year in 8 different prisons in Scotland. And it was out of that kind of experience in many respects and pursuing a kind of academic, not a career, but pursuing life in academia, that those two kind of things came together, and it led me into prisoners' rights organisations and doing the research which I did. And that research was very much based around the prison medical service, healthcare in prisons. And the reason I kind of got into that was because at that point in time, prison healthcare was not within the National Health Service. And I'll come back to that later on. Prison healthcare was outside the National Health Service. And the healthcare that prisoners were receiving was, in the main, pretty poor, to put it mildly. Over and above that, at that point in time, there was huge controversies over the use of drugs to control prisoners. Drugs such as Valium and Librium, Largacto, chlorpromazine were being used, not in a medical sense, but were being used to control prisoners, particularly prisoners who were regarded as disruptive. That was also particularly apparent in women's prisons, where women were disproportionately injected with drugs. So it was a huge controversial area at the time in the 1970s. And writing from a critical criminological perspective, it seemed to me and some others at the time that the whole question of who gets to speak about prison life had been neglected. In other words, prisoners and their voices had been neglected. And that was the case in the 1970s and coming through these around a whole range of other groups, because it was just at the time when women who had been beaten in terms of domestic violence, they started to get their voices heard. Black people, in terms of racist attacks and racial harassment, they started to get their voices heard. Gay people, in terms of their sexuality and the harassment around their sexuality, began to be heard. So critical criminology picked up on those voices and challenged the silences which were there within the discipline. And what critical criminology also did, it challenged the truth, and I'm using truth in inverted commas here, that the state articulated about prisons. So when the state said prisons were fine, critical criminology began to challenge that through the research that was being conducted. When the state articulated the idea that women somehow brought violence against themselves, the feminist movement challenged that. When the state articulated the view that black people were somehow out of place in terms of the harassment that was constructed against them, black people's organisations challenged that. So there was a fantastic move in criminology to actually bring on board and challenge state talk, as Stan Cohen called it, state talk, Cohen and Taylor called it, and to actually challenge the silences, because the position was, well, who gets to talk? If we think about that, who gets to talk in this world? Whose voices get to be heard? And overwhelmingly then, and arguably still now, it was the voices of the powerful. And the voices of the powerless were left on the margins in many respects. So that was my experience in that first year, and it was very interesting. I still remember the first year I went into the prison, giant prison in Glasgow. And I was at the back of the room, and we were introduced to the deputy governor, I think it was, or the governor, yeah, I think it was at the time. Anyway, he had a pretty fearsome reputation and been involved in all sorts of issues with Scottish prison. And we were explaining the research, and he was sitting like that, tapping a riot stick. Really, that's all he did when we were explaining the research. And at the end of it, he said, there's a couple of things I don't like, do-gooders and folk with do-gooders in particular, actually was things. So, I mean, we're just taken away and left in the prison itself to start the research. And so that was a kind of interesting experience in and of itself. Who gets to talk? Who maintains silence? Who doesn't maintain silence? And that inevitably involves a question of power. You know, the great kind of, if there's nothing else about critical criminology, it's about questions of power and powerlessness. And silence and talking and truth are all bound up in that question of power and powerlessness. So that was the motivating factor really, and then through that I became involved, as I said, with the prisoners' rights movement, and then went to work at Open University and registered for a PhD. And that PhD was on the prison medical service itself, and the role of the prison medical service, the historical role of the prison medical service. Why it was a historical piece of work, you might ask, why did you do it historically and then contemporaneously? Well, the simple reason for that is, I'm not going into all the details of it, you know, it'll take a long time, but the simple reason for that was, I'd written a book with Mike Fitzgerald called British Prisons, and in that book we pointed out that drugs were being used to control prisoners, and we got sued for libel by 6 prison doctors. So we spent a year in the courts trying to deal with this libel case. They said we'd libelled them and therefore damaged their reputation. So the publishers, we spent a year in the courts and we lost the case, as it turned out. We had to make a grovelling apology in the Guardian. If anybody wants to see it, I've still got it here. I get very bitter and twisted about it, but there it is there. We used to wake up in the morning and you get these are libel letters, in case anybody's ever seen them. Shall I pass it around? Does anybody want to have a look at them while you're here? If anybody gets a libel letter, don't forget to give me it back, but there it is. So we got sued for libel, and I then thought, well, I'm registered for a PhD. I'll write about the history of the prison medical service. Why? Because you can't be sued by dead people. That was one reason. And a very important one, because I really wasn't wanting to go through the court case again. Also, what was interesting, the very first morning, I'd forgotten all about this until recently, the very first morning of the case when we went to the lawyers in London, there was loads of press people there, on the streets, loads of them there. So we thought, oh well, this is our case, so kind of, we were young, you know, press, etc. But as it turned out, the lawyer who was acting for the publishers, our lawyer, who was acting for the publishers, was also the lawyer for the painter, the Queen's painter, the guy who looked after the Queen's paintings. And that weekend, he'd been unmasked as a Soviet spy. So the press were all there to see him rather than us, sadly, you know, at the end of the day, because we thought our moment had come in terms of being in a film or whatever. Anyway, I wrote my PhD and went back in history to trace the role of the prison medical service, heavily influenced by Foucault's work, right? And the role of the prison medical service in the control and regulation and discipline and punishment of prisoners. And what did I find when I went back into the historical archives, right back to the end of the 18th century? Well, prisoners were treated appallingly inside in terms of the conditions that they experienced in terms of their medical care. And indeed, interestingly, drugs were being used right at the beginning of the 19th century in a way which was really interesting in terms of controlling and disciplining them. So, that was the kind of start of that, and that was the PhD, although when the thesis got passed I had to then get it back because there was a couple of alleged libelous passages in that as well, so it was never leaving me in many respects. That thesis was published as a book called Medical Power in Prisons in 1990, but again before the book came out I got a 17-page libel report on it, and there was a couple of passages that were suggested it was problematic in that book as well. Particularly pertaining to the death of a prisoner. So there was a debate about whether some 700 words, I think it was, should come out. But my point being, it's an interesting process because, you know, critical criminology is about attempting to speak up and attempting to kind of challenge dominant truths. But there's a whole series of other processes perhaps then involved when people do start to write. There's the libel laws, there's the Official Secrets Act, there's the kind of regulation and control that happens with regard to research. So what is acceptable research? And what is unacceptable research? Who gets to define what research is? Who gets to define what is unacceptable research results? Who gets to define what is the public interest, for example, in terms of the release of research? All of those things are absolutely vital in terms of thinking about research does not stand outside above these processes of power and powerlessness and the attempt by the state to regulate and control particular aspects and particular dimensions of the research process. So medicine in prison was a healthcare crucial subject, and as we come through the 80s and into the 90s, it was still a major aspect and debate within the prisoners' rights movement. Eventually, and very, very interestingly, at the end of the 90s and coming into the 21st century, the prison medical service was eventually abolished. Interestingly enough, it was eventually abolished. A campaign that had been going on for so long eventually led to the prison medical service being abolished and the National Health Service taking over prison health care. Yeah? Now that would be regarded as a victory, and it was in some respects quite clearly a victory. Critical criminology played its own little role in that. But in actual fact, what's been very interesting subsequently, which I want to come on in the second part of the talk, what's been very interesting is that victory, very, very important. But in actual fact, I was in prisons at the time doing research on healthcare, and at the time it was really interesting seeing national healthcare workers who were then going to be involved in prison healthcare. And many of them, you know, still carried the same attitudes as people on the outside, that prisoners didn't really deserve decent healthcare. They didn't really deserve decent healthcare. They didn't deserve decent food. They didn't deserve decent family visits, right? They were there to be punished even further. And they forgot that very basic maxim, that very basic argument, that when people go to prison, right, when people are sent to prison, they go there as punishment, they don't go there for punishment. And I was saying to Phil earlier, you know, with the debate in our first year class yesterday about it, and I was pointing out, if I went and locked that door there, and we were all stuck in here together for 3 months, okay? We'd all get a wee bit jittery, wouldn't we? We didn't have our mobiles, we'd all be a bit like that, yeah? Starting to get a wee bit jittery. And then we started to be looking at the folk next to us. I don't really know them, and they look a bit dodgy as well, yeah? The confinement process. If we were stuck here because we know criminology, don't we? For the surveys that have been done, when did you last break the law? That many of us, maybe all of us, except myself because I'm respectable, but all of us, many of us, may have done something for which we could have finished up in the criminal justice system, possibly, yeah? Maybe even possibly finished up being confined for that. So let's just imagine that that has happened, and in here we're stuck with each other. Would we want decent medical care? Would we want decent food? When we provide prisoners with lack of medical care and lack of food, does that do very much about the crime rate? We know from the surveys that have been done, what's the most important aspect of individuals not committing crime? It's the fear of getting caught, isn't it? If we think we're going to get caught, then maybe think twice about it. There's a moral issue as well, of course, with morality there, of course, and that's an important dimension to it. But we also know that, oh, there's not many people around. That's a nice ashtray when people used to smoke in pubs, for example. Just to that for my nice table, yeah? Oh, yeah, I'm coming through customs here. No customs people there, I don't see it. Oh, lovely nice bottles of Scotch whisky there, whatever. You get the drift, yeah? So that idea, that correlation, or indeed cause and effect, which many in the new right in criminology would argue, that the more prisons we have, the more deterred people will be from committing crime, is an immensely problematic argument. And therefore, that argument of the people going to prison as punishment and not for punishment is still a really important issue to be had. And therefore it followed logically from that medical care in prison, compared to what it was like historically, should be on the same level as medical care on the outside, because it's as punishment and not for punishment. So anyway, the prison medical service was abolished, and National Health Service took over, but arguably, it's like anything in research, as we were talking about earlier, there's pros and cons, there's positives and negatives. You can't guarantee by doing a piece of research that that's subsequently going to have a major impact, might not have any impact, or indeed you might not even know the impact that it has. You might not even know the impact that research has either. Sometimes there's consequences and negative consequences or unforeseen consequences that folk don't think about. Sometimes the power structure remains the same. Sometimes it's fundamentally challenged and fundamentally altered. Or sometimes even, and it's one of the things I really think about critical criminology, sometimes it's made an inch of a difference. Just an inch of a difference. And in making that inch of a difference, you know, it makes a difference to the world. Yeah? And sometimes the grand narratives, it's easy to get sucked into them, the grand narratives about massive social change. Very, very important. Sometimes, you know, it's the very, very little things. And the charity that I'm a trustee of now, Inquest, which I'm going to come on to in a minute, and deals with deaths in custody. You know, we say in that charity, look, if we prevent one individual from being thrown into a prison cell and ignored, and therefore they subsequently cut up and kill themselves, if we prevented that, and a member of staff turns away and says, no, I'm going to treat that person humanely, then we've done something. We'll never know about it, but we've done something positive and made a positive intervention. So research and that whole idea of making this massive intervention into the world can of course have positive consequences. Sometimes it can have unforeseen consequences. Sometimes it can have consequences that you would never have thought of, but it doesn't get away from the basic underlying moral imperative that critical criminology should be making interventions into the world. Because, you know, criminology is of course treated as an academic subject, and that's right and proper, that it should be. But it's also a moral discipline as well, M-O-R-A-L, being moral and having those interventions and ensuring, whatever the area is, it doesn't matter if it's prisons or not, it doesn't matter. Whatever the area is, that those interventions are done in such a way that can have a moral, positive, good, beneficial impact on the world and those people who are at the sharp end of a whole series of processes involved with the state and the criminal justice system. So that was a libel case, and the grovelling apology in the Guardian. I forgot about to have pulled my file out, and I was looking at it and I thought, oh, I'm moving from being a critical criminologist to a psychopath here, because this was so heavy at the time. I've got to stop here if anybody wants to look at it afterwards. Is that okay so far? Does anybody want to ask any questions, or am I speaking too fast? Too Glaswegian? No? No? Is that okay for everybody? Okay. So that was that research, and it was still part, and by 1999 I finished up back inside for 9 months actually on the 3 prison medical wings, 3 different prisons, interviewing prisoners and prison officers about their experiences of healthcare. And one of the really interesting things about that, and I was really interested in the staff as well as the prisoners, and I was very interested in, I don't know if any of you have been in prisons, but research is very often, the best research is often conducted at 7 or 8 o'clock at night, you know, and the silence of those wings, because prisons are about noise as much as anything else. They're about noise, except if you've seen Steve McQueen's film called Hunger. That's about the silence of prisons, but generally prisons are about noise and smell. But when it gets to 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, and lock-up is happening, sitting interviewing staff is really, really interesting. And a number of them talk very movingly actually about their life inside, and we talked about the fact that some of them broke down on tape, and they broke down on tape because they felt that the job that they were doing wasn't appreciated, and they were getting a hard time, and the hard time very often was coming to other prison officers, because a number of the staff I interviewed were pejoratively, negatively labelled as care bears. That was the label that was used with them, because they attempted to deal with prisoners humanely, positively, and with empathy, and they were negatively labelled as care bears. And in one of the particular prisons I met 2 of the best staff I'd ever met actually, who were leaving the prison service because they couldn't handle, and I'm just saying that negatively towards them, nobody could have handled the pressure they were under because of that. And in that particular prison, one evening, some of you may, I don't know if you've done Erving Goffman's book, Asylums, I don't know if you know that book, it was published in 1961. It's a fantastic book. And Goffman talks in that book about, well, what do total institutions do to people? What's the essence of when people go into a total institution, a prison or a hospital? First of all, they're degraded. They're degraded. Degradation ceremonies are called. So your hair's shaven, not so much now. You get a uniform. And I saw a man in one of those jails where he was made to strip behind, actually a bit like that, filing cabinet behind there, and he had just a small towel covering, and he was half blind, and he was made to walk along the table like this in front of everybody, and then at the end he was saying, there's the toilet to go, and he was just with this little towel around him. That was a degradation ceremony in Goffman's view, in my view from Goffman. And Goffman also talked about how institutions don't just degrade people, not just prisons but hospitals as well, but they mortify people. So look at us in this room. We've got a sense of self, haven't we? We've got our clothes, we've got our hairstyles, we've got a sense of identity about who we are. Institutions aren't about that, they're about changing you from a name to a number. Yeah? Uniform, number, second name, degrading, mortifying. So your sense of self comes under attack. Your sense of self comes under attack. That very identity that makes you what you are as a human being is challenged, undermined, and you finish up the attempt to create something different from that. Not in a rehabilitative sense, but in a mortifying and degrading sense. So Goffman, if you want to check it, it's a fantastic book, Asylums from 1961, degradation ceremonies and the mortification of the self, because it can be so much applied to different institutions. And some of the women in my class have talked, when they've read it, they've talked about having had babies, and the experiences that they had in hospital were very much like Goffman described them, in terms of degradation and mortifying, and how their sense of self came under attack. So it's a wonderful book, Asylums, but as I say, 1961, but still there, very important. Okay, now because of that work that I did on the prison medical service, I was asked to become a trustee of a charity. Well, sorry, let me go further back in time. Because of that work, a charity called Inquest was founded in 1981, right? And this charity, so it's still going, you can check the website and send the stuff over, inquest.org.uk. So we've been going for 30 years now, over 30 years actually, yeah, Inquest. And that charity was founded in April 1981, it came together as a result of a number of deaths that people had experienced at the hands of the state. Some famous, some not so famous. A man called Blair Peach was killed by the Special Patrol Group in 1979 after a demonstration at Southall, an anti-Nazi League demonstration. Really famous case. There was a very famous case on Merseyside involving a man who died in custody. And there was a very famous case in prisons as well, a man called Barry Prosser, who was found dead in a prison. He was on remand for causing damage to a door handle worth £1.39 or £1.29. He was on remand and he was found dead in the particular prison he was found dead in. And he was found dead with his stomach and oesophagus, I think that's how you pronounce it, burst. He'd been struck so hard by the blows that killed him that his stomach and oesophagus burst. Those deaths caused outrage at the time, and the state, of course, had an explanation for them, very much from a positivist perspective. These people had brought the deaths on themselves. They were somehow different, there was something pathologically different about them, and somehow, wrong place, wrong time, brought the deaths on themselves. Inquest, coming out of the radical prisoners' rights movement, refused to accept that state-defined truth, coming back to that point again, state-defined truth. And so the organisation was founded in 1981 and is still going strong. 7 members of staff now, working out of London. And you can check the website out, it's got tabs on deaths in custody over the last 20 or 30 years. So I was asked to kind of be part of an advisory group, and then I'm a trustee of the organisation now. It sounds a bit glamorous, but actually trustee involves hunched over accounts very often and trying to work out where we're going to get money from, and trying to get people to join the organisation, etc, etc. So please go on the website, and particularly anybody that's interested in deaths in custody. There's lots of data and statistics there tracing the number of people who have died in general, the number of young people, minority ethnic prisoners, the number of women. There's lots of cases up there as well that you've been interested in. Inquest.org.uk. So I've become part of that organisation, and very, very important. And it looked to me when I started, and of course it came out of prison medical stuff, because prison healthcare stuff, because a number of people were dying because of lack of medical care. So in that sense, things were still immensely problematic. A number of people were attempting to kill themselves because of the lack of medical care as well. And what we found as our inquest, particularly in the initial days, started to point to the fact that prisons contain highly vulnerable individuals. Highly vulnerable individuals. And because of that vulnerability, their experience in prison, which I'll come back to in a wee moment, becomes even more intensified. And that's how we can then start to explain the high rates of people cutting up, and the high rates of attempted suicide, and the high rates of suicide, self-inflicted deaths, I should say, inside. Yeah? Not because of pathological reasons, as positivists would have it, or the state would have it, but because of the nature of the environment. Many of them are finishing up inside. And you know, we can talk about that, when we talk about deaths, we can talk about it, we can talk about it right across the board. The number of people who die in hospitals as a result of the way that hospitals are organised. The number of people who are killed each year by the state. Wayne Morrison in 2006 said that in the 20th century between 167 and 175 million people were killed by states alone. 167 to 175 million people killed by states. Deaths in mental health settings. Got a PhD student doing that just now. Deaths in hospitals, as I mentioned earlier. Deaths in care homes, another dimension to it as well. And just a general aspect involving deaths. So every year, one kid is dying every 15 seconds in India, for example, as a result of hunger. Yeah? When you start to add that up in terms of the number of children that are dying around the world when we're in here for this hour and a half, it's astonishing. Is that their fault? Arguably, not arguably, definitely arguably not in that respect. So, death and the social construction of death itself, critical criminology and inquest and these various organisations have attempted to get beyond the idea that death is natural and inevitable in prisons and indeed elsewhere, and actually looked at the social construction of data around death. And once you get into that, then you're into the two key concepts that I mentioned earlier: power and powerlessness. Power and powerlessness. And once we start to think in those terms of the deaths in custody, then we're into a different set of arguments with regard to how we understand these particular events. So, when we look at custody, just some of the figures here. When we look at some of the figures here, they're all there. Just a couple of them from the Inquest website. Just between 2000 and 2009, as an example, 1,610 people died in prison. 1,610 people in those 9 years, just as an example. You get the later figures up on the Inquest website. Yeah, it's just as a really interesting example of that. Between 1990 and 2007, 115 women died in prison. 88 of them, these deaths were self-inflicted. Right. 1990 to 2007, 88 self-inflicted deaths of women in prison. So the question is, what is it about this environment? And there's lots of other statistics up there in regard to this. Oh yeah, one more. Between 1990 and 2009, 30 children self-inflicted deaths. Self-inflicted deaths of 30 children between 1990 and 2009. So the question is, how do we explain it from a critical criminological perspective? How do we explain that? Well, of course, again, positivists in the state would start to explain those deaths in terms of, well, there's something wrong with these individuals. There's something wrong with them. There's something pathological about them. There's something different about them. There's something deterministic, you know, that classic positivism. They're propelled by forces beyond their control to take their own lives. That would be the conventional definition. Something pathological, something different, something determining them to propel themselves into committing crime. And in doing that, that classic argument from positivism, which we maybe come across, that individualises the problem, doesn't it? It looks at the individual and says there's something wrong with those people, pathological, different, or whatever. So that's the general kind of explanation that the state would articulate, and particularly a kind of conventional criminological explanation. That these people are somehow have put themselves at risk, and therefore we need a scientific explanation, because that's what positivist claim, isn't it? Traditional criminology, or science, and if we can find the causes of crime, we've cracked it. We might as well all just go home and become estate agents or whatever, because we're always looking for the causes of crime, aren't we? In the head, in the brain, in the chromosomes, in the personality, isn't it? And it's always been, I mean, it's a really basic point, but it's always something that's really interesting, isn't it? Why is it we're always looking downwards to find the causes of crime, towards the powerless? Why don't we look upwards? Because bankers never commit crime, don't they not? Bankers have never committed a crime in their life, as far as I can see, yeah? The powerful never commit crime. People don't die at work as a result of what the powerful actually do. We never look at their chromosome abnormalities, because they're right just. We never also look, don't we, at their family structure. That's always an interesting one for me. You know this business about chavs, yeah? Look downwards at the family structure of the poor, because somehow the poor's family structure is leading them into commit crime. Now it's very interesting, because this is a class of people who will tell us, look at the family structure of the poor, it's really terrible. And it's the very class of people who, when their kids are 5 years of age, what do they do with them? Get shot of them to public schools, don't they? They get rid of them, don't want them around, yeah? Now, if that isn't a kind of pathological family structure, I don't know, if you wouldn't want your children around, or your nephews, or your nieces, or whatever. Let's get them off to public schools. But no, that family structure's never looked at, you know. Why don't we look at the family structure of the bankers? Because it would seem to me, if you're sent away to public school when you're 7 years of age, and you're freezing, you're in your dorms, and you're not with your family, just maybe that might have an impact on your headspace when it comes to balancing books and all the rest of it. But we don't look downwards, do we? Sorry, we don't look upwards, we always look downwards. Something pathological is wrong with these people. Something pathological, that's the kind of, well, in actual fact, there is the work of inquest and the fantastic team of people that work there, and the way that they've went about it, particularly putting the families of those who have died in custody, putting families, the family experiences right at the centre of the argument, provides us with a different, an alternative set of arguments, you can say. And those arguments look at the nature of the prison environment itself, the structural issues involved with regard to the prison. The fact that prisoners are still regarded as individuals who don't deserve decent treatment for a start. What about the experiences of prisoners? There's a wonderful book by Diana Medlicott, who never got the recognition it deserved, actually, about self-inflicted deaths in prison. And Medlicott was interested in people who'd actually attempted to kill themselves in prison. And she interviewed a number of them and wrote this wonderful philosophical analysis. It was about men in prison, but philosophical analysis about the pain of imprisonment. And the great criminologist, Pat Carlin, always says this. Pat Carlin always says this: prisons are about pain and punishment. Prisons are about the infliction of pain and punishment. And Medlicott and others have used that kind of analysis to actually start to look at the experiences of prisons. Looking at the trauma, for example, of the admissions procedures. When people come into a prison and it's really, really, back to Goffman, mortification, people come through, they're whisked through, they're not treated with the humanity, but they're just whisked through, taken to their cell. And it's very interesting, the research at Inquest has done, a high proportion of self-inflicted deaths occur within the first hours of people being admitted to prison. So reception and what happens there is very, very important in terms of the environment. And that's been reinforced by what goes on in prison in terms of now the whole public expenditure cuts, staff not having time, the cutbacks that have happened, the rising prison population, etc., etc. Yeah? So that whole environment and that initial experience that Medlicott brilliantly demonstrates is part of why it is that individuals may try and either kill themselves or indeed engage in self-inflicted death. So the question of self-harm and the question of self-inflicted death and the environment that people are engaging under, and the fact that so many younger people as well, and women, and minority ethnic groups, and the vulnerable, and the powerless, all of those groups become really, really important in terms of understanding the structural issues around power and powerlessness. Distress, vulnerability, lack of empathy, lack of understanding, lack of love, lack of care. Those were the experiences that people talked about when Diana Medlicott interviewed them. And those are exactly the experiences that the families of prisoners who have died in custody talk about as well. When they talk about what had happened to their loved one and their relative, that's exactly the expressions they use. Now, the families are really interesting and very, very, very important, because their experiences, you know, until Inquest was formed in 1981, their experiences had been marginalised as well, right? And they suffered that traumatisation, being traumatised by not only what had happened to them, what had happened to their loved ones, but what had happened to them when they went to court and they went to inquests. Because when they used to turn up in court initially, they had no lawyers. They would be faced with a bank of lawyers working for the state funded, and these families had nothing in many respects. And over the last 30 years, Inquest, the organisation Inquest, has built up a whole group of lawyers who now give free legal advice to the families of people who died in custody. So Inquest has not just been about gathering the data, but it's been heavily involved in trying to make policy interventions, getting legal advice for these families, getting policy changes at the coroner's court level, okay? Because the experiences were so traumatic. Listening to the families of the families involved, yeah, and what happened to them in terms of the process of bereavement, and bringing their stories in and their histories in to the account. And then, of course, in bringing that in, you've got another, as I said earlier, a whole other series of individuals and groups being severely traumatised by the events that they'd experienced as well. So the families and their experiences, and you'll see some of them up there, there's various reports that Inquest have done, built around interviewing families. You'll see them there, and those experiences, very, very moving, shocking in many respects as well, in terms of what happened to them and the complete and utter traumatisation process they went through, and some of them still go through with regard to that. So Inquest has been, the organisation, the charity, has been about not just documenting in huge detail the number of deaths in custody, but also the way that these families' experiences have been through the coroner's court process, and try to get it to the policy changes. And you know, it's been very interesting doing it. One of the really interesting things is we've had tremendous support, the organisation, tremendous support in the House of Lords. It's quite interesting to me when people talk about abolishing the House of Lords, actually, because the support we've had from people like Lord Ramsbotham, who's ex-Chief Inspector of Prison, Vivian Stern, who worked in NACRO, the National Association for Care and Resettlement of Offenders, and others, has been in the Lords, the House of Lords, where Inquest support has been most profound, not necessarily in the Commons, quite interestingly. So it's an interesting, but it's a slight aside, but it's an interesting issue with regard to that. No, if you criticise state policy, you must be pro-crime and anti-victim, yeah? And Inquest and other organisations have had that because you criticise state policies. Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because when the state talks about, oh, well, we're concerned about victims, well, let's look at that from the perspective of 2014. Look at the report that was published in February by Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary, where nearly every police force in the country, without fail, was performing terribly when it came to domestic violence. Yeah? So the most recent research in the area has shown that those victims are still seen as immensely problematic within the criminal justice system. So when the state says to us, or those critics, hey, you know, you're pro-crime or anti-victim, well, let's look at the state's track record when it comes to victimisation. Let's look at the state's track record when it comes to sexual violence, when it comes to domestic violence, when it comes to racist violence, yeah? When it comes to the social construction of the victim, and who is regarded as a respectable victim, and who's regarded as a disreputable victim, yeah? And we only need to look at the accounts of women who finally managed to get to court, and when they talk about being raped and sexually violated and what happens in those court proceedings to them, yeah? So that whole pro-crime and anti-victim has been very, very interesting in the way that the state has articulated a very precise view and built around the idea that there are certain individuals who deserve to be regarded as victims, but a whole range of other groups and individuals, including prisoners, and indeed women who have been domestically abused and violated, don't deserve to be regarded as victims. So the point I'm making is that the inquest is operating in as you know, a law and order climate, and that law and order climate is still dominated by the idea of deterrence and punishment and pain, and it's still built around the idea that there are some people who should be regarded as legitimate victims and other people who are regarded as illegitimate victims. And the fact of the matter is, when we look at how the state does respond to very, very serious crimes, especially regarding domestic violence, then their policies have failed, and have failed lamentably in many respects. Lamentably. And that isn't just me saying that as some kind of, crazed critical criminologist here. That's the state itself saying it. That's the Chief Inspector of Constabulary saying it in February, March time, 2014. Yeah? So when they talk about inquest and other groups being pro-crime and anti-victim, not only is it offensive, actually, but at the end of the day, they don't actually live up to their own rhetoric when it comes to dealing with victims of crime. So, what do we conclude on this in many respects? How should we think about this in terms of the role of research? Well, you could argue that critical criminology has played a really crucial role in many respects with regard to understanding the world and understanding not just prisons but across the board. We've got the concept now of social harm, which is a major aspect of critical criminology's work, thinking about the harms that are done to people in all sorts of different areas, thinking about how social harmful activities, whether that's the environment, whether that's in working conditions, whether that's within prisons or without prisons, that whole social harm perspective has added yet another dimension to thinking about what crime is, or indeed what crime isn't, and what gets defined as crime, what doesn't get defined as crime, what gets defined as deviance and what doesn't get defined as deviance. So in that sense, critical criminology is still very much alive and well and in good health in many respects. In a broad theoretical sense, and that's very, very important. It's also, I think, important to say that critical criminology's work has attempted to influence the kind of policy dimensions and to think about the different policy dimensions involved. And it doesn't take much thinking about in many respects, because again, even in the state's own terms, they're immensely problematic. The state will say, well, we can't actually afford this. Well, how much do we spend in the criminal justice system every year? £16 billion. Not millions, £16 billion. Where does that money go? That's the interesting question, isn't it? In the context of a society where until very recently rape crisis centres were getting closed down, and yet we're spending £16 billion. Yeah? £16 billion. Where does the money go? Who gets to spend it? Who benefits from that massive expenditure pattern? We can send that, as Russell Jacobi, a great American philosopher, made the point a few years ago. He said, we can send a rocket to Mars, but we can't find the wherewithal or resources to fix a defective social order. Now, don't get me wrong, because outside my kind of criminology head, I'm really into astronomy, and I absolutely love astronomy. And if you go onto the NASA website, just as a wee aside, the Voyager spacecraft, which left here, Earth in 1977, yeah, and it's the furthest thing ever that human beings are sent into space. On the NASA website, you can see the counter clicking. So as you're watching it, it's showing you the spacecraft moving further and further away from Earth. It's absolutely far out and brilliant, actually, in many respects. But that's a wee aside. We could spend that high-tech money landing rockets on the moon, and quite rightly so, and going to Mars. But as Russell Jacobi said, the great American philosopher, at the end of the day, where does the money go in terms of the fixing of social order? So there's that dimension to it as well, in terms of making those interventions and arguing for a different perspective in terms of expenditure patterns. Starting to argue from a critical criminological perspective, Angela Davis's great quote or great concept, arguing for abolitionist alternatives. Maybe arguing that reform has failed in many respects, as Foucault says in Discipline and Punish, but for 200 years of reform. Great part in that book, towards the end of the book, where he lists all the criticisms of the prison system that were mounted at the beginning of the 19th century. It's the same criticisms that are being used now, 200 years on. So for 200 years of reform, and where's it got us? Where's it got us? We've got more prisons, more police, big debate about crime falling, and that's a big argument, that. But even if crime has fallen, as you've seen in this morning's newspapers, it hasn't fallen in terms of rape and sexual violence. Yeah, actually. So even if you accept that argument, crime's fallen, there's still all these other issues and areas. But more police, more prisons, more privatisation coming on board. Yeah, a crime control industry, isn't it? We're all part of it, including myself. We're all part of it. I mean, as I said, if we could snap our fingers and crime stopped just now, what would we all do? Yeah, we're all part of that crime control industry. But at the end of the day, where is it going? Where is it leading us? Has it made us feel any safer, any less anxious, any more protected? Arguably not. So Angela Davis argues for abolitionist alternatives, and that in many respects is what Inquest does as well, trying to argue for a system which is built on truth, justice and accountability. When you go on the website, you'll see that. Truth, justice and accountability. Democratic accountability of these institutions. And I want to think, I want to finish actually with a quote. I think there was a guy I interviewed the last time I was in, and I'll finish on that because it's 12 o'clock now, and I know folk might want to get off. But I want to finish this guy I interviewed the last time I spent a substantial amount of time in. And I thought it really got to the nub of thinking about people thinking about themselves in prison in many respects, and getting beyond that kind of pathological model that they have. And he said this: as we get older, we get more ailments because that's the way of life. As we get older, our bodies start to wear out, things go wrong, so we need that little extra bit of medical care. And irrespective of what people may think, we are still a person. Irrespective of what people might think, we are still a person. We may be behind the wall, we may be behind bars, but we are still people. We will never be altered from that. We will always be people. We may be older people, we may not be, shouldn't be in here. It's probably our own fault we are in here. So he was recognising that. But we are still people, he said. And that's the way it is, and it always will be. And they can't change that. They can't change that. So irrespective of what we've done, we are still people. Yeah? And they can't change that. And I thought that was kind of a way of summarising in many respects what it means to be in there. And that is not in any way to condone crime. It's not in any way to be, as I said earlier, in any way to ignore victims, because I don't think the state can take the moral high ground in that particular shape or form at all. But it's a way of actually trying to recognise that there's differences here, and that research can make that. Right back to the point I made, it can make an inch of difference. And if you see making that inch of difference, that's making a huge mile difference to the world in many respects. So anyway, I'll leave it there. I was kind of banging on it there, sorry. Okay. Last region, I think. I need a Blackburn accent. I think that's what I need here, rather than. Yeah. Does anyone want to ask any questions? Or? is that the whole business now about physical restraint, yeah? And in fact, it's a really good point, because I was reading The Guardian this morning coming over, that physical restraint is going to be part of this new super prison that's been built for young people, you know? So I think that the whole argument is a really good question, so thank you very much. And it's back to the whole business about, well, what goes on in these places, and what is the central core values in these institutions. And like I said, I mean, what was really interesting to me, the places I've been to, the occupational culture in these places and the training that staff get is very much about, there's a great book by Elaine Crawley, and she got into the prison officers training school. She was appalled by the training mechanisms that were employed there. There's an occupational culture which is about dehumanisation, but there's staff in there who can back like 30 years when I first went in, or 40 years now nearly, I'd met, and as I said, we're going to have time, and it's that restraint, punishment, pain still becomes the driving force in many respects, with, of course, some really strong elements of empathy and understanding and love and cherishing and all the rest of it. But I think in a society which is so dominated by law and order and so dominated by the idea that somehow people have to be punished for what they're doing. That, and then, please again, don't get me wrong, that in no way, shape or form is to justify what some folk in prison have done. I mean, I spent one day last summer in Grendon Underwood prison, and that prison holds men, 92% of them are into serious crimes of violence. They're doing long sentences. But yeah, it's an interesting institution, and the governor, Jamie Bennett, does a lot of talks around the country. He's a wonderful speaker. And one of the things, just maybe think about it, bringing you maybe, but one of the things he was talking about there was, one of the things the men were talking about was trying to change themselves through interventions. And do you know what they said? It was really interesting, and it took me right back to when I first went into prison, was the fact that that prison, although they're treated well in it, is still doing hard time. Why is it doing hard time? Because they're having to come to terms, A, with the terrible things that they've done, and B, confront their masculinity. And we're all like that in many respects, aren't we? It's easy for all of us as human beings to kind of go along, but when we try to change ourselves, quite fundamentally, that's hard time, you know, that's hard time. So you don't necessarily have to be thrown into a cell and left for 24 hours a day, where you're trying to deal with your own psychological issues. That's hard time. So it's a really good question, and it's there. I mean, it's still there. And when Chris Grayling can say, you know, that those who are, you know, criticise the prison system are leftists and whatever, I mean, that's no way of a debate. You know, the debate should be what can we bring and argue, debate about, and try and see a way forward on it. So thank you for that. Sorry,
that seems to carry on from Jill. You didn't get the question.
Right, okay. You got another one.
Just leading on from that, I think when they banned the physical restraint in STC in 2008, due to the high-profile deaths of the two young boys that suffered due to that, is there anything in particular you think has brought that back on the table as well? Now we should go back to that, despite that court ruling at the time.
Very interesting question. It's a very interesting question, and I think that as part of, there's a general election coming up for a start, you know, and let's talk about it, there's that coming up. Yeah. And how to out-tough the toughness of the prison system, you know, so that each party's out-toughing each other, so I think there's an element of that, there's no two ways about it. I think there's also, an aspect of it which is about the fact that the age of social anxiety that we're living in now, that gets translated into scapegoating, you know, and that whole social construction of these individuals as the scapegoats for outside the anxiety that many of us feel, and beyond is the political structure and the anxiety that those individuals feel. So it's part of a kind of social and cultural process, I think, and the reaffirmation of pain and punishment.
Yeah, criminalisation of youth, but
the criminalisation. Yeah. And youth, look, you know, young people are regarded as demons, aren't they? 3 or 4 years ago in my street, I saw a couple of police officers walking along, so I went up and asked them, and I said to them, so what are you doing? I was just kind of curious as a criminologist, and as a really boring individual, you know, never letting it go. And they said, we're trying to prevent young people from congregating in the street corner, you know. And I said, well, I've lived in this house for 20 years, you know, and I've never seen young people congregate in the street corner. Do you know what? It wouldn't bother me, actually, at the end of the day. Well, no, that's what I'm trying to do. I says, look, you know, if this is about kind of crime and harm, I said, I'll show you what upsets me and makes me feel anxious. We walk to the end of the road, and I've got a main road. There's a main road at the end of my road. And I said, see that road every morning? I'm trying to avoid getting killed on it, carrying my criminology books and all the rest of it, right? Who's causing me problems? Middle-aged men driving up and down the road at the speed of light, yeah? And their red TSR2 Thunderbolts, whether these cars are. That's what causes me problems, not young people playing their music and all the rest of it, standing on street corners. So it is part of that, the criminalisation of young people, and young people also still being regarded as scapegoats for this broader sense of crisis we're in. And it's a really, really interesting question, because if you look at the stop and search figures, they're astonishing. In Scotland has got the highest rate of stop and search in the United Kingdom. There's a research project done at Edinburgh University on it. And one of my relatives, one of my nephews, he's a really, really quiet lad. Tried to get him into critical criminology, but he wants to be a business person, and that's fine, you know, don't hold any kind of grudges there. But he's a really quiet lad, doesn't he say booty, a goose, etc. Goes out with his mates. I think it's about 4 times he's been stopped and searched. His name taken, right? They're just hanging out. Now, that pure use of those powers, I think, is really kind of profound. You know, it's really kind of profound, and it's works its way into the criminal justice system. So you're absolutely, it's all, and the, excuse me, the informal, that whole informal power structure, power network, people being stopped, maybe not being recorded, etc., under the various sections, the various acts. That whole informal structure of power is a really important dimension of how the criminal justice system operates as well. And then it leads on to what you two are exactly saying when they finish up in these places and the degradation that happens in there, you know. Does that answer that? Anybody else got any questions?
Yeah,
Yeah,
question. You know how the moral panic obviously in society and how crime generally people read in the news. How was that back in them days when technology wasn't as good as it perhaps is now?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well, actually, yeah. Yeah, well, if you read Stuart Hall's work, you've done Stuart Hall's work on moral panics.
Doing moral panics at the moment.
Yeah. So Stan Cohen, John Young.
Stan Cohen.
Yeah. And Stuart Hall, Policing the Crisis. And the moral panic around mugging in the early 1970s. And it's a really interesting question that does the new technology help to fuel moral panics even further? I don't think there's much work being done on it. I mean, the main newspapers and television still there, demonising young people and highlighting them as essentially immensely problematic. The role of the state is still there in terms of constructing them as folk devils. That's undoubtedly true. There's also a whole range of, the 35th anniversary edition of Policing the Crisis was just published last year, not last year, beg your pardon, and there's a whole new introduction to the book, and they talk about new moral panics, or new groups in there who are now being, the new folk devils, sorry, and the moral panics around them. So I think in balance, I think that you know, people talk about the new media as a kind of the social media, and I actually think it's anti-social in many respects, but that might be my age in many respects, because you know, this country they've talked about, oh yeah, it helped with regard to the Middle East and demonstrations. There's an element in that, but actually I think in many respects that behind that new technology is American capitalism. And you know, as we know, to get an extra buck, they will do it in any way, shape or forms. And I think it's individualised human experience. So it's a really interesting, it sounds like a dissertation here, you know, third year dissertation, whatever, you know, to be writing about. And that link, I think probably in many respects it will do, you know. I don't think it then use, some of the new media of course are completely anti the general consensus, and of course challenge and get alternative truths out, and I think that's you know, terrific, that's great. But the general edifice, the general structure, I think is still there. And Steve Toombs, my colleague, well, he's gone to York University now, Steve Toombs has also talked about, well, non-moral panics. Why is it that there's some behaviours which aren't, there's no moral panics around them in many respects, like bankers.
Yeah, they're exaggerated almost, aren't they?
Yeah.
And it is a lot from the media. The media
Yeah.
does play a big part
Yeah.
in it.
Yeah, absolutely, and stereotyping.
Yeah.
And typification, as Jock Young said, and the way that all of those, and of course, go back to actually what's been said here, maybe that's the link as well, amplification, you know, the way that these issues then get amplified in the media, and they become the common sense. Not everybody believes everything they read in the media, of course they don't, you know, but it becomes a kind of common sense, a starting point for understanding all sorts of social problems. When folk reject it, don't they? And they say, well, we're not interested, we're not going to participate. But you're absolutely right, you know, you're absolutely spot on. That becomes the central focus and the central way of understanding it. So it's definitely a dissertation there, I think. I don't think it's been written about that much, to be honest. So thank you very much for that. Anything else?
Right, so, perfect time.
Perfect timing as well.
Yeah.
So there we are.
Right, yeah, just a couple of things to bring us to an end. Thank you for turning up, thank you for your questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Huge thanks to Joe for giving up his time. This, I think, is the example of us being in an academic community whereby, you know, if we were in the private sector, would somebody from a competitor come to give up his own time at his own expense, you know, to talk about what's interesting? And obviously, I doubt that. So, I say, I'd like you to remember that. But then, secondly, surely different things that Joe said, I would think could apply to all of you, whatever on year 1, year 2, and year 3. Whether it was the social harm thing for those of you in year 1, or whether it's in terms of positivist labels for people, whether people deserve the labels that are given to them, that kind of thing. Surely there were things in there that are relevant to all of us. And I think the thing that I'm going to take away from this, and I hope you will, is the idea of being a critical criminologist is something that we all do. If we're challenging you know, versions of truth, recognising that there are different truths out there, so this idea that the state gets to define what's true and what's false is surely something that we're all interested in.